In today's video, we're diving into the 5 most brutal bear attacks ever recorded. From a grizzly attack in the waters of Alaska to a fatal encounter with a spectacled bear in Peru. But first, let's travel to Alaska, where a hunter becomes brutally hunted. It was September 9th, 2016, on the upper Kenai drainage near Cooper Landing, Alaska. Low fog clung to the black spruce and alder slopes above the narrow valley floor. In that area, a single hunter was moving through the thick brush, convinced his prey had fallen somewhere close. He didn't know something larger had already taken it. Mark Ellison, 42, was a lifelong outdoorsman from Wasilla. A lineman for a local utility company, he spent nearly every fall bow hunting for moose or caribou, often alone. He had killed his first bull with a recurve at 16 and still preferred stalking over waiting in blinds. His garage was lined with labeled bins, broadheads, calls, dehydrated meals, all arranged with near military precision. He believed that preparation controlled risk. That weekend, he was after a bull moose rumored to be roaming the Kenai River drainage. Mark's plan was simple. He would hike early Friday, track sign until dusk, then camp on the ridge above the flats. He carried his compound bow, a canister of bear spray clipped to his chest, a silver tarp, and a GoPro mounted to his chest harness. He knew the area well enough to navigate without flagging tape, marking waypoints on his GPS instead. The hunt was partly for meat, but mostly for solitude. He told his wife he'd be home by Sunday night. 2 nights out, no risk. By late afternoon, the clouds had lifted, revealing steep slopes draining into thick, waist-high alder. Mark followed a faint blood trail along a narrow game path, the ground soft and uneven under his boots. He stopped once to nock an arrow, noting the wet, fresh tracks pressed into the mud. There were small signs he missed. The trail he followed narrowed suddenly, brush broken at waist height. The musky odor of decay mixed with bear scent. Dense, sweet, unmistakable. The wind shifted from his back to his left, carrying his scent toward whatever lay beyond the next turn. He slowed but didn't retreat. The blood drops thickened, the brush grew tighter, and he believed the wounded moose had collapsed nearby. He whispered into his GoPro that it was fresh, and the camera picked up a soft exhale before a deep, low growl rolled through the brush. Brown bears along the Kenai Peninsula are massive, often exceeding 800 pounds, with a bite force strong enough to crush bone. Most avoid humans, but they defend carcasses aggressively. A startled bear at close range almost always charges, driven by instinct rather than hunger. Rangers had posted warnings earlier that week about fresh kills near drainage points, areas where bears fed before winter fattening. Whether Mark saw those warnings was never confirmed. What happened next was captured almost entirely on the recovered footage. The GoPro shook violently as Mark pivoted, the lens catching a blur of brown fur surging from the undergrowth. His arrow loosed mid-draw, vanishing into the mass before impact. The bear struck within seconds, knocking him backward. The camera fell into the grass, half covered by dirt. Audio recorded heavy breathing, a single gasp, then wet tearing sounds mixed with muffled thrashing. For 19 seconds, the sounds continued, snapping branches, short, choked breaths, before everything went silent except for the faint hiss of wind in the microphone. Investigators later determined the bear was an adult female, roughly 700 pounds. The attack likely lasted less than half a minute. The position of Mark's bow and spray canister suggested he never had a clear chance to deploy either. Deep claw marks on the trunk of a nearby spruce showed where the bear had spun during the charge, consistent with a defensive reaction. His body was found partially covered with soil and leaves, a behavior common among bears protecting a carcass. His left shoulder was dislocated, and the neck showed crushing trauma consistent with a single bite. Rangers found him that evening after his GPS unit transmitted a stationary signal. It took nearly 3 hours of helicopter search to pinpoint the location, guided by the glint of his silver tarp. When they arrived, the bear was still there, circling the kill site. One ranger fired a warning shot, but it only retreated a few yards, huffing and stamping before finally moving off. The team secured the scene under fading light and extracted his body the following morning. The autopsy in Anchorage confirmed severe cervical fractures, extensive lacerations to the torso, and major blood loss within minutes of the attack. His lungs contained forest debris, suggesting he was alive briefly after the first impact. Wildlife officials ruled the attack a defensive incident, noting the presence of the moose carcass nearby. The sow was tracked for 2 days and euthanized after approaching the recovery team on the second night. Authorities issued a brief statement classifying the death as an unintentional wildlife encounter. The funeral in Anchorage was small and private, held 3 days later. His compound bow rested beside the urn, strings cut. Mark's friends described him as the least likely person to take unnecessary risks, someone who measured every shot and step. His death, they said, was a reminder that even perfect discipline bends under chance. Local hunters left a pair of arrows at the Kenai trailhead that week, their shafts marked with his initials. The following spring, the site where he fell grew over with alder again, quiet, empty, and unchanged. But even as the seasoned bow hunter learns that experience means nothing when you step between a brown bear and her kill, in Alaska, the gravel of one riverbank would be stained with blood and silence. It was July 15th, 2015, near Yakutat, Alaska. The Situk River ran cold and swollen from glacial melt. 2 men stood far apart on opposite banks, absorbed in the quiet routine of casting and reeling. The sound of water on gravel carried clearly through the mist, until something heavier broke it. Nathan "Nate" Collins was 37 from Whitehorse, Canada. He worked as an equipment technician for a regional power utility, a job that kept him grounded through long Yukon winters. Fly fishing was his balance. Precision, patience, and quiet mastery over motion. He had spent years learning the rivers near home, but wanted something wilder. When his longtime friend Dylan Price invited him to Alaska for a week-long trip, Nate called it a chance to test his line where the real fish run. He had the skill, the gear, and the judgment that came with time in the bush. What he didn't have was experience with Alaska's bears. Grizzly bears in this region can exceed 800 pounds, driven by the annual salmon runs to feed near rivers and tidal flats. They spend up to 20 hours a day eating in midsummer, building fat for hibernation. While most avoid humans, food competition or surprise encounters often trigger defensive attacks. Locals knew that when the wind shifts, silence can mean proximity. Fish carcasses and scat along the bank were warning enough that morning. The 2 friends flew in on a bush plane from Yakutat, bringing tents, waders, and a small arsenal of bear deterrents: spray, flares, and bells. Dylan had fished the Situk before and knew where salmon pooled beneath the cutbanks, but this particular tributary was new to both. They set up camp near a gravel bar, a half-mile from where the water split into shallow braids. That morning, they split up to fish opposite sides, agreeing to stay within sight. Nate carried his bear spray clipped to his vest, a habit more for compliance than fear. He had never had to use it. Dylan had noticed them first, a half-eaten salmon, fresh tracks pressed into the sand. He shouted across the water that they might move upriver, but Nate only nodded, assuming it was an older kill. The breeze then shifted, blowing from Nate toward the downstream bend. He didn't notice the faint ripple breaking against the gravel bar. Dylan saw movement first. A grizzly, dark with wet fur, head down and feeding on a salmon near the bend. It lifted its muzzle, sniffing. The distance between the two was less than 40 feet. Dylan later told investigators that the bear stood upright, chest broad and dripping, swinging its head to catch the scent. It grunted once, a low sound that cut through the river noise. Dylan yelled, waving his arms, and Nate glanced back just as the bear dropped to all fours. The stride was explosive, the distance closing in seconds. Nate reached for his bear spray, but the canister's safety tab snagged on his vest strap. His rod clattered against the rocks as the bear hit him full force, the impact carrying both into the shallows. The GoPro mounted on Dylan's cap captured part of it, chaotic motion, splashing water, and the dark blur of the bear before the frame jolted as Dylan turned and ran. Dylan froze for a moment before bolting for the tree line, shouting for help and blowing his whistle. He looked back once and saw the bear shake Nate by the shoulder, jaws locked deep. Evidence recovered later showed the fight had lasted only seconds. Blood on the rocks formed two distinct pools before the trail turned into alder thickets. Branches were snapped head high, and drag marks continued roughly 200 yards downstream. Rangers alerted by Dylan followed the trail and found the remains the next afternoon, partially buried with soil, moss, and leaves, typical catching behavior used to hide food from scavengers. Autopsy reports confirmed multiple bite wounds to the shoulder and neck, and crushing trauma to the upper spine, consistent with a fatal bite early in the encounter. There were defensive lacerations on his arms, indicating he had tried to shield his head. Spinal trauma would have caused immediate incapacitation, with death following within seconds to a minute. The site showed no signs of prolonged feeding, suggesting the bear had dragged the body, cached it, and left. Rangers later identified it as a mature male, estimated around 9 years old, based on tooth wear and size from previous monitoring records. When recovery teams arrived by boat, they used loudspeakers and warning shots to push the bear back before retrieving what remained. They left the carcass site undisturbed after collecting biological samples and photographs. Dylan sat on the opposite bank through most of it, silent, hands shaking as he held his fly rod across his knees. He had returned to camp the night before, unable to sleep, convinced he'd hear the bear again in the dark. Authorities later ruled the attack defensive and natural. The bear was not pursued. Officials noted that wind direction and proximity to a kill zone made avoidance nearly impossible once the scent was carried. Dylan flew back to Whitehorse the next morning, leaving their gear behind at camp. Nate's ashes were returned to Canada within a week, the urn carried home by his sister. As the grizzly's victim was laid to rest beneath an Alaskan riverbank in the Arctic darkness, a research team would discover that exhaustion and a single forgotten safety protocol could transform their camp into a hunting ground. It was March 3rd, 2017, on the frozen edge of the fast ice in Kongsfjorden, Svalbard. The glow of a research outpost was faint against the horizon. 3 tents sat in a shallow depression on the ice shelf, their thin walls snapping under wind pressure. Inside one of them, Jonas Nielsen shifted in his sleeping bag, unaware that a white shape was already crossing the darkness beyond the camp perimeter. Jonas was 32, a field assistant from the University of Copenhagen's Department of Geosciences and Natural Resource Management. He had been part of several Arctic expeditions before, logging hundreds of hours in sub-zero conditions while collecting data on sea ice thickness and salinity. Colleagues described him as methodical and even-tempered, the kind of person who took pride in quiet reliability. This trip, though, carried weight. Their measurements would feed into a climate model funded by the Norwegian Polar Institute, a partnership Jonas wanted to be part of permanently. The team had spent 16 hours that day drilling cores and deploying buoys across the shelf. By evening, exhaustion dulled their routines. They pitched their tents on compacted snow, recorded wind readings, and shared dehydrated meals by headlamp. It was near midnight when they realized the tripwire alarm, a string of flares that detonated if disturbed, hadn't been armed. The team lead, Anders Holm, decided they could set it at dawn, citing fatigue and clear weather. Jonas agreed. Polar bears, they reasoned, usually approached from downwind, and the fjord wind that night blew steadily offshore. They were wrong. Polar bears in the Svalbard archipelago can weigh up to 1,300 pounds, capable of sprinting over short distances at more than 25 miles per hour. They are highly intelligent, using smell to locate food up to 20 miles away. In early spring, with sea ice thinning, bears often scavenge campsites for any trace of protein, including human scent. Attacks are rare but usually fatal, driven by curiosity or hunger. The camp sat 2 miles from the frozen fjord's edge, surrounded by nothing but sculpted snow and drifting ice rubble. Around 3 a.m., the bear emerged from the fjord's edge. Satellite wind data later showed the direction had shifted east, carrying the camp's scent across the flats. The animal's tracks indicated a deliberate approach, slow, head low, weaving slightly with the wind. The bear reached the perimeter. Tracks made it evident that it circled twice before moving to the center tent, which was Jonas's. The nylon sagged inward as the bear pressed its snout against the fabric, inhaling. Inside, Jonas stirred, hearing only a faint crunch outside his ear. When the paw came down hard, the aluminum poles snapped instantly. The fabric tore open, and the world filled with cold air and fur. Jonas shouted, a single sharp sound that jolted the others awake. Anders unzipped his tent and saw the bear already dragging Jonas by the torso, the sleeping bag tangled around his legs. What followed came from both survivors' statements and photos later taken by the rescue team. Anders fired the first flare, a bright orange burst that lit the ice field like dawn. The bear flinched but didn't release. A second flare struck the snow near its hindquarters, the flash reflecting off its coat. It turned its head, jaws still clamped across Jonas's ribcage, blood bright against the white fur. When the third flare went up, the bear dropped him, backing several steps before retreating into the darkness. The flare smoke lingered for minutes, drifting above the tents. Jonas was unresponsive and barely breathing when Anders reached him. His parka was shredded from shoulder to waist. The bear's teeth had punctured through the upper spine, fracturing vertebrae, and collapsed one lung. The other researcher, Mikkel, used a thermal blanket to cover him while they radioed Ny-Ålesund for immediate evacuation. They attempted first aid for roughly 20 minutes before his pulse faded. When the helicopter arrived at 6:05 a.m., the scene had frozen solid. The bear's tracks looped around the site, vanishing toward the fjord. Jonas's body was lifted into a thermal bag and flown to Longyearbyen, then Copenhagen. Autopsy results showed spinal separation, multiple rib fractures, and internal bleeding, injuries consistent with instantaneous fatal trauma. The teeth impressions matched a large adult male, approximately 9 feet in length from nose to tail. Authorities from the governor of Svalbard investigated the camp later that day. The tripwire flares were still coiled neatly beside the tents, never deployed. The conclusion in the official report called it a preventable lapse in field safety. No effort was made to track the bear, as its behavior was deemed non-persistent, an isolated incident of food seeking, not predation. The university suspended all solo ice shelf fieldwork for the rest of the season. A memorial was held 2 weeks later in Copenhagen, attended mostly by researchers and students. His parents declined to speak. However, even as the orange flares faded over the Arctic ice, in India, a mother and son would discover that the simple act of gathering flowers at dawn could awaken a fury hidden in the shadows. It was April 22nd, 2014, in the Kankar district of Chhattisgarh, India. The first light was just breaking through the mixed sal and mahua forest, catching on the damp leaves and low mist. The forest floor was littered with pale yellow mahua blossoms, sweet-smelling, a sign of the short harvest window villagers depended on. That morning would begin like any other, quiet and practical, until the stillness broke in the most violent way imaginable. Savita Rao, 41, had followed the same gathering routine for years. A widow since her mid-30s, she lived with her only son, Rahul, in a small clay-walled home on the forest's edge. Her husband had died from malaria, and since then, Savita had relied on seasonal forest products, tendu leaves, mahua flowers, tamarind, to support herself and pay for Rahul's school fees. Locals described her as steady and uncomplaining, someone who rose before dawn and returned before the heat. Her son often joined her, carrying a small basket and following close behind. That April morning, the pair left before sunrise to collect mawa fallen overnight. They walked 2 miles from their village using narrow animal tracks, where the dew still clung to the undergrowth. The season's yield was good, and the scent of fermenting flowers was strong enough to draw insects and animals alike. It was routine, but the forest had been different lately. Reports of sloth bears seen foraging closer to villages after a late honey season had circulated for weeks. Still, Savita had never encountered one in her years of collecting, and she trusted that keeping to soft voices and open ground was enough. The trees around the low clearing stood close and uneven, their roots hidden beneath dry leaves. Mahua blossoms lay thick in some places, mixed with damp soil and animal tracks, mostly boar and cattle. The air felt unusually heavy that morning, with no wind to move the mist. In this region, sloth bears often used old termite mounds, fallen logs, or shallow scrapes to rest during the day. Though smaller than tigers, they were far more unpredictable, known for poor eyesight and a tendency to attack with extreme ferocity if startled. Their claws could reach 3 inches in length, and a standing male could weigh over 300 pounds, delivering blows strong enough to crush a human skull. That day, there were no other collectors nearby. As the sun began to break through the mist, she and Rahul moved toward a shallow gully lined with old trees. What neither of them realized was that one of those hollows held a sleeping sloth bear, a solitary male, likely disturbed by human scent. Rahul later told villagers they were speaking softly about breakfast when the bear exploded from the brush, roaring. The animal came at Savita. Its initial swipe struck her shoulder, spinning her backward onto the ground. Rahul froze for a moment, then screamed. The bear's second blow tore through her scalp, and she tried to shield her face with her arms, but it raked down again, claws catching her cheek and neck. Sloth bears often attack faces first, an instinctive defense to disable threats quickly. The impact crushed her jaw and opened deep lacerations across her forehead. She shouted once, a raw sound cut short when the animal clamped its jaws onto the side of her head. Rahul ran then, dropping his basket and sprinting down the path toward the village. Behind him, the bear continued to maul his mother, pressing her into the ground with both forelimbs. The sound of distant voices, villagers shouting after hearing Rahul's cries, came to the scene. They saw the bear give one last huff, then turned and lumbered into the forest, vanishing through the brush as quickly as it had come. By the time the first group of villagers reached Savita, she was still breathing but unrecognizable. The front of her sari was shredded, her face and upper chest soaked in blood. One arm was broken, twisted beneath her. The bear's claw marks were visible in 4 deep arcs across her scalp, exposing bone. 2 men carried her out on a makeshift stretcher made from branches, while another stayed behind to keep watch in case the bear returned. She stopped breathing before they reached the dirt road leading to the village. Her body was laid on a woven mat outside her home until forest officers arrived. They recorded the coordinates of the attack and collected soil samples around the hollow where the bear had rested. The autopsy at Kanker Civil Hospital confirmed massive blood loss and crushing trauma to the skull and jaw. Officials noted that the pattern of injuries, facial focus, no feeding behavior, was consistent with a defensive sloth bear encounter. In the following days, forest officers conducted a search using tranquilizer rifles, but found no trace of the animal. Loudspeakers were distributed through nearby villages, warning people to avoid early morning gathering and to travel in groups. Rangers placed temporary signboards along the forest path where Savita died. Her funeral was held the next evening, quiet and brief, the air heavy with the scent of wood smoke and mahua flowers. Rahul was sent to live with an uncle in Raipur soon after. As the forest of Chhattisgarh took a mother's final breath, in Peru, a German tourist would learn that wandering alone through the cloud forest in search of the perfect photograph could lead him into the feeding grounds of South America's only bear. It was February 11th, 2018, in the cloud forests of Urubamba Province, Peru. A dense mist hung over the ridges that morning, softening the outlines of the Andean slopes and swallowing sound. The tour group moved slowly up a narrow path that wound through orchids and moss-covered stones, cameras clicking in the damp air. Somewhere between the low hum of cicadas and the muffled footsteps, Thomas Lang began to drift from sight, just a few yards at first. By late afternoon, he would be gone entirely. Thomas was 45, a software engineer from Munich who had saved for years to travel through South America. He cataloged every trip, every expense, every photograph. Hiking had been his balance to a sedentary job, a way to measure control against uncertainty. Peru was supposed to be the high point of a long-planned sabbatical. He had read about the region's flora in field guides and carried a small macro lens for close-up photography. His group was traveling with a licensed guide from Cusco, following a standard circuit along the slopes below Machu Picchu, spending nights in small lodges and days on foot. Lang's decision to separate wasn't impulsive, so much as routine. The fog that morning made visibility low, but the forest around them was unusually alive. Orchids in bloom, ferns unfurling, fruiting trees drawing birds overhead. He told the guide he wanted to capture the light on the mist before it burned away. When the others moved on, he stepped off the main path, following a smaller track downhill toward what he thought was a clearing. He had done this countless times before on safer trails. The fog made distance deceptive, and within minutes he was out of earshot. The forest there was steep and thick, layered in vines and moisture. Epiphytes hung from every branch, and the air carried a sweet, fermenting scent from ripe figs that littered the ground. Spectacled bears, South America's only bear species, frequented these groves. They were smaller than their northern relatives, most males weighing between 250 and 400 pounds, but powerful, built for climbing and tearing into fruit clusters or termite nests. They were largely solitary and avoided humans, though territorial encounters had been recorded when people came too close to feeding areas. Their strength lay in their forelimbs, long curved claws and shoulders capable of hauling full-grown livestock up trees. The guide noticed Lang's absence around midday. The fog had thickened, and the group assumed he had taken a wrong turn toward a nearby ravine that looped back to the main route. When he didn't appear by evening, 2 porters retraced the path, calling his name and firing a flare. They found no trace of him before nightfall. The local ranger post was alerted at dawn, and a formal search began by helicopter and ground teams the following morning. By then, rain had washed away most footprints, and the area where Lang had wandered descended into a dense, fruiting slope that even locals avoided during harvest season because of bear activity. What happened in those missing hours was later reconstructed from the evidence. Lang's tracks led down a gully scattered with fig remnants, his camera strap found tangled in a root halfway down. Marks in the mud showed he had slipped, one boot print deep, the next smeared, suggesting a fall onto his side. The claw impressions began there, wide and deep. The bear had likely been feeding nearby, startled by the sound of a fall and sudden movement. In close quarters, spectacled bears often respond with short, explosive charges meant to intimidate intruders. In this extremely rare case, this one didn't bluff. Forensic analysis showed the bear struck from less than 10 feet away. Lang's jacket was torn from the shoulder down, with parallel slashes consistent with claws nearly 3 inches long. He may have tried to raise his arm in defense. One sleeve was shredded to the elbow, and bone fragments in the soil indicated a broken forearm. The bear's first bite landed on the upper back, crushing the scapula. From there, the animal's weight drove him into the mud. The ground bore drag marks, evidence of struggle as Lang tried to turn or crawl. The camera was broken against a rock, its lens cracked, body dented, still containing the last image, an out-of-focus patch of moss and fruit. The bear's second bite left punctures through the neck and skull, instantly incapacitating him. The pattern matched a territorial mauling rather than predatory feeding. The bear likely withdrew after realizing the threat was neutralized, leaving the body. Blood spatter analysis showed no further movement afterward. The scene was silent except for rain that began sometime later, washing much of it into a shallow pool near the base of the gully. 2 days later, searchers found the remains by following vultures circling above the ravine. The body lay face down in mud, boots still on, backpack torn open beside him. His camera and phone were recovered nearby. The autopsy in Cusco confirmed massive cranial and thoracic trauma consistent with a bear attack. Claw marks scored the back, 4 distinct arcs that aligned with the spacing of a large adult male. Time of death was estimated within hours of separation from the group. Officials concluded that Lang's death was a rare defensive encounter, not predation. The bear was not tracked or destroyed. Park authorities temporarily closed the trail and posted new advisories warning visitors against leaving marked paths. The guide company issued a statement calling it an unforeseeable tragedy, though internal reports later noted that fog protocols had not been enforced that morning. The photographs from his final trip were recovered from the memory card, most showing mist, stone, and small flowers, the details he'd always sought to preserve. His death marked one of only a handful of fatal spectacled bear encounters ever documented. A reminder of how quiet the distance can be between curiosity and danger. Thanks for watching. If you liked these stories, click here for more.